So we're going to do a couple more examples, but before we do, I want to run through our updated troubleshooting checklist. So again, this is a list of things to check. If you think that your program, should be working correctly, but it just doesn't seem to be, this is kind of a first list of things to check. The things in blue are the new things we've added since the last time. So one of the things I advised you to check last time is to make sure you register a listener to your component, such as a button. But now I want to make sure you register a listener to each component. So if you have multiple radio buttons, for example, you have to register a listener to each of them. Sometimes, you don't think about each, you think about kind of a set of multiple choice options as being one thing, but Java treats them as individual radio buttons, so each one of them needs a listener. The other thing to check if you're working with radio buttons is make sure that you add each one both to the button group and to the panel. Remember, the button group is just the logical grouping of the radio buttons, but adding them to the panel is what will actually make them show up. Now, for when you're working with drawing programs, a couple additional things to check. You want to make sure that inside that paint component method, that the very first line is super.paintComponent, and this should be the parameter that you have in your method, whether it's pen or G or whatever you've called it. And then also, if you want to update your display, you need to make sure you're invoking repaint. So that's an easy thing to forget. If you change something about your drawing and you don't call repaint after that change is made, it won't be changed. And so sometimes it can be confusing. I'm clicking a button and the drawing isn't changing. Well, you need to invoke repaint to make sure that happens. So here's another updated list. This is still in progress. We have a few more things we're going to add between now and the end of the series on GUIs. So let's move into a couple more practices. We're going to start out by modifying our face program. So we're going to add a button to allow the user to change the color of the drawing. And for right now, the button's just going to show up as part of the drawing space. We're going to look eventually at how to change that so that we could keep kind of the drawing space and the button separate from each other. But for now, it'll just be on top of the drawing. So I'm going to pull back up the Smiley GUI program. And I'm going to add a button. So this is just like a class, like any other class. I can add an instance data variable. I'll call it color button. And then inside my constructor, I'll initialize that variable. Now this is a button, so I need to follow that same process that I normally do. I need to add it to the panel. Now we're not using a main panel object in this class. Instead, the class we've created is a panel. So I'm not going to add the button to main panel. I'm just going to add it to the current object, which is this. So this.add my color button. Then I do need to register a listener. So color button.add action listener, new button listener. And I'm going to go over to the GUI template, and I'm just going to borrow the listener class template code. So once you kind of start getting into the hang of GUI programming, you'll figure out that you can use sort of different pieces of the templates at different times. You don't necessarily always have to start from the full template, but you can kind of just pull little pieces where you need them. So for this case, I'm just going to pull out the code for the listener class. So here I have my button. I've added it. I've added a listener. So let's run this program before we worry about writing the listener. There we go. Again, you can see that the button's kind of on top of the drawing space and nothing happens when we click it because we haven't written any code inside of our listener class yet. But that's what it looks like to add the button. So what I want to do when I click the button is I want the eyes to change color. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is instead of drawing the eyes based on a hard-coded color like this, I'm going to create a color variable called eye color. And in the constructor, I'll initialize eye color to green. And then down in the paint component method, which again is the method responsible for drawing the window, I will set the color of the pen to be eye color so that it's using that variable instead of a hard-coded value. Then inside my listener, I can change the color. So I can say, well, if the eye color is green, let's make it black. Let's make it blue. And otherwise, meaning it's blue, let's make it green. So this will change the colors back and forth from blue to green. Oops, and that should be double equals, of course. Now the last very, very important thing I need to do is I need to call repaint. Let me comment this out for a minute and you can see what happens. so nothing happens. And actually, if I add a little system.out.println for the eye color, you'll be able to see that the color variable is in fact being changed as a response to the button. So if you look down at the bottom here, you'll see it's flipping back between green and blue, but we're not seeing it on the display, and that's because we have not told Java to update the display. So the only way Java knows to update the display is by calling repaint. That's how we can force an update. So now, there we go. We get the color changing from green to blue. Okay, so let's do another practice. This is going to be another example of using event handling in withdrawing. So we're going to write a little GUI. We're going to start off just writing a GUI that draws 50 circles of random size and random color, and then we'll go ahead and add some buttons to that program. So because I'm going to be doing drawing, because I'm going to be doing some drawings, I'm going to start with the draw template. And I'm going to go through and start by cleaning it up, so eliminating the comments, updating my class name. At first, I don't need any variables for this. I'm going to start out probably not sure I'll need any as we make modifications. Update the name of my constructor. I'm going to make the background color white. There is my code that must stay the same. Paint component with the first line being super.paint component, and I'm going to come back and that's where my drawing code is going to be. Then down in main method, I create a panel object and call the constructor of my panel, add that panel to the frame, and I do need to set the size of my frame and give it a title. Okay, so if I run this, just looks like that. That's good as what it should look like at first, just nothing there yet. So I had said I wanted to make draw 50 circles of random size and random color. So inside my paint component method, and again, just like all these other practices, I actually recommend that you stop the video, go ahead, do the practice yourself, and then come back and watch the solution of us all together. So I'm going to have a loop. And I usually like to avoid hard coding numbers into my code directly, so I'm actually going to go ahead and create a variable. I'll call it num circles, and I'll initialize it inside my constructor to be 50. Okay, and then I'll use that. So what I want to do is I want to draw 50 circles of random color and random size. So let's start with the random color. So we've seen this code before. We create a new random object, and then we can create a red value, a blue value, or a green value, and a blue value, and then create a new color using that red, green, and blue. Of course, we have to import random, and then we'll set the pen to be that color. Okay, so now I need to draw a circle. So I have my draw oval method available where I want to say the x, y, width, and height. So I want these to be a random location and a random size. So for my x, I can generate a new random number, but what should be the maximum? Well, the maximum should really be the largest size of my window, which I set down here in main as 400, 400. But now since I'm using 400 more than once, I'm going to go back up and I'm going to make this one a constant. Width and height. And I'll use the constants here. Note that I could have also made num circles a constant. I actually didn't do that because down the line we're going to make a modification to change num circles. But actually, you know what, I'm going to put that, but for now, if we were just writing this program, really this one also should be a constant. So let me change that just so it's consistent for now, and then we can make the change later. Okay, so now I've got my width and my height, my number of circles as constants. So for my x value, I'm going to generate some x value somewhere between 0 and the width. And for my y, I'm going to generate some random number somewhere between 0 and the height. And then for my diameter of my circles, so the width and height will be the same because I want to draw circles, not ovals. So I want that again to be a random size. So I have to decide what the max size should be. Maybe I decide I want it to be half the width or a quarter of the width or something like that. So I can do that. I'll say maybe width divided by 2 is my maximum. Okay. So that should draw my 50 random circles. So let's go ahead and run this. And there we go. There are my 50 circles of random sizes and random colors. Now I want you to watch what happens when I resize this window. You'll notice that all the circles are being redrawn. So we're generating new random circles within the space. Now that's because I mentioned briefly once before that paint component gets invoked behind the scenes whenever your panel or your window needs to be redrawn. Now you can force it to be redrawn by calling repaint, but there's other times that it will just naturally be redrawn, such as when you resize the window. So when you resize the window, Java needs to redraw the panel, and it does that by calling paint component. So any code that you have inside of paint component is going to be executed every single time you redraw the window. So just be aware of that in terms of what it means for your display. So if you're doing things like a random display or animation, again, that paint component method will be invoked every time you resize the window. For our purposes, for this program, it's fine, but there might be some places when you want to take some of that code and move it outside of paint component so that it doesn't happen every time paint component is called. Especially if you have any code that is sort of computationally heavy or you have a lot of stuff you're doing, if you can move it outside of paint component so that it only has to happen once, that's usually a good idea. So just be aware that if you have code inside of paint component, again, it's going to be called every time the window needs to be redrawn, including when you resize it and also when you minimize or maximize. So take a look, for example, at that little green, sort of smallish green circle at the top left. When I minimize this window and maximize it, you'll see that circle's gone. It's been redrawn. So resizing the window, minimizing and maximizing the window, those are all times when Java will redraw the window. So just be aware of that in terms of what code you put inside of paint component. So only put things in there that are really necessary for the drawing. So that's the first part of our program. Now we want to go ahead and add a redraw button. So we want to add a button to, instead of having the user resize the window to redraw, we want to force a redraw. So I'm going to create a button. And in my constructor, I'll initialize it. Add it to the panel, which is the current class I'm writing, and add a listener. I'm again going to borrow my listener template code and add this in here. Now, just like in the last example we looked at, the button is going to be on top of the drawing. We're going to look a little bit later at how we can change the look and feel of that. So what do I want to happen inside my listener for this button? Well, I want to redraw all the circles, so essentially that's just forcing an invocation of paint component, which I can do with repaint. So there we go. Now we can click the button and it'll redraw. Okay. Now we're going to add a checkbox so the user can decide whether the circle should be filled or unfilled. So right now we are invoking draw oval, but we could just as easily invoke fill oval, which would look like this. So our circles are now filled instead of just outlines, but we want to let the user have that choice. So I'm going to make a J checkbox, call it the fill box. I will initialize it inside my constructor. Oops. And I'm going to initialize it. I'm going to leave it as the default of unfilled because initially I'm just going to draw the circles. I'll add it to my panel. And then I need to add a listener. So again, I can create a new listener class, or I can use the same listener class I just wrote. But if I am using a listener class for multiple components, then I might need to modify my code. In this case, I only want to do a repaint if, actually, I think I always want to do a repaint. I think I might always want to do a repaint. So let's see. We'll leave that there for a moment. What I need now is I need some sort of variable to keep track of whether the user wants to fill the circles or leave them unfilled. So I'm just going to create a Boolean for that. Call it filled, and I'll initialize it to false. And then inside my listener, I can just check to see if the fill box is selected. Then filled gets true. Otherwise, filled gets false. And then I think no matter what, again, I do want to repaint after we make that check. So anytime the user interacts with the checkbox, it's going to trigger this. Listener, and then it will determine whether they should fill or not and do a repaint. So filled, and oops, I didn't change this back to draw. That's the other part actually I need to fix, is I need to actually now in my paint method, I need to say, well, if it's not filled, then just draw it. And if it is filled, then fill it. Okay, so redraw still works. Filled, we'll now fill them, and we can do a redraw, and we can unfill, redraw, fill, etc. Okay. So one last modification to make, we're going to add radio buttons to see if we wanted them to be drawn in random colors or just a single color, let's say just black, so it's just drawn in black and white. So I'm going to add my radio buttons. I'm going to add a black-white button and a random color button. Again, we need one button for each choice. And then I'm also going to need a Boolean draw in color, I'll call it. So down in my constructor, I'll create my black-white button. Add it to the panel. Add a listener. I'm going to use the same class. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Oops, and this is a new JRadio button. Same thing for my random color button. I want the drawn color button to be initially selected, since initially I'm using my random color, so I'm going to set the default of that to be true. Add a listener. Then I need to create a button group. And add each of my radio buttons to it. So the black-white group.add black-white button and group.add random color button. Then I also need to set my, what did I call it? Draw in color to be true. Okay, so let's just make sure it looks okay. There's our options. You can see you can only draw one of them. Now notice that it is being repainted when I change, because anytime I interact with any of these components, it is triggering that listener, which includes a repaint. So that's why that's happening. Of course, it's not changing the color or black and white because I haven't written that part of the code yet. So here I can go down here, and I can say, okay, well, if the black-white button is selected, then draw in color is false. Otherwise, if the random color button is selected, then draw in color is true. Now notice that I just used a simple if else for the checkbox, but I use an if else if for radio buttons. That's because checkboxes only have two states. They're either selected or they're not selected. But radio buttons, you can have multiple states, right? In our case, we only have two radio buttons, two options, but maybe we had a third option, like maybe it was draw in black and white, draw in blue and red, and draw in random colors or something like that. So it's a good kind of habit to get into to use the if, else if structure for radio buttons, because you potentially have more than just two options. Okay, so that sets the Boolean. And now down in my paint method, I can go up to my color here and I can say, well, I only need to do all this if we're drawing in color. Otherwise, I can just set the pen color to be black. Okay, so now we can run. And if we click black and white, we get just black. We can redraw, we can fill. Not very exciting in black and white. Set back to color, unfill, redraw, set to black and white, and so on. Okay. So there's another example of using drawing, also using some event handling mixed in with the drawing. Again, keep in mind that troubleshooting checklist, and we're going to continue to build on that as we learn more.